I think that maritime instability is now the norm. For the last, let's say, since World War II, for the last 70 years, the United States has preserved the freedom of navigation on the oceans globally. And we're reaching a point where, as some of our earlier speakers alluded, the cost asymmetries of what we're dealing with, and if I hate to use the word democratization when we're talking about Houthis or other folks, but it's very cheap these days to use AI, and it's very cheap to build drones. And we're facing a cost asymmetry of at least 50 times. So maritime instability is going to be the new normal, unfortunately, and we have to get our game on.
So why don't you walk through a few slides? I have some questions for you related to the Middle East and AI and China. But before we get there, why don't you give us a kind of some background of what you uniquely know that you think others should know?
Yeah, we have a sort of a funny name. It's called Mare Liberum. For those of you that studied Latin, it means freedom of the sea. And what we do is we invest at the intersection of critical technologies, which is very broad. It's AI, it's robotics, it's additive manufacturing, et cetera. Very big sector. And maritime, which is also a very big sector. So it includes things obviously like shipbuilding and ship repair, but also port, maritime insurance, et cetera. So that confluence where those two circles meet is what we do. And this is really a context-setting slide for those of you that are not as familiar with the oceans. But effectively, 80% of global trade moves across the oceans. And 2 years ago, I mentioned the Houthis earlier. The Houthis disrupted $1 trillion worth of trade in the Red Sea, which is obviously child's play compared to what's going on in Hormuz. If you were to pivot over to what's happening in Asia, $10 trillion flows through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and the Chinese Navy is already bigger and, in many ways, more formidable than ours. And they don't have to deal with the tyranny of distance. So, for example, it takes 15 days to sail from Pearl Harbor to Taiwan. The Pacific Ocean is very vast. For the ecologically minded, 20% of animal protein comes from the oceans, and 90% of the wild fish stocks are depleted. And finally, perhaps most importantly, 99% of internet traffic, not 20%, not 15%, 99% of internet traffic flows through submarine cables. And in the last couple of years, we've had 44 reported cable cuts. So this is a little bit about where we invest. There's a national security thread, there's a commercial thread, and then there's new ocean tech. The ocean tech is pretty neat as well. Things that didn't exist 5 or certainly 10 years ago, ranging from, if you guys can see this, it's a robot that's 3 to 5 miles below the ocean, collecting critical minerals nodules that are on the ocean floor, cobalt, manganese, nickel, et cetera. So that's a little bit about what we do.
So, Eric, what do you see as war of the future? We know what war is today. Where's it going?
First of all, let me preface it by saying war is bad. There's no other way to define it. I can't think of an admiral or a general or a captain that wants to write home to somebody's parents that said that their sailor or soldier died. And war should be avoided at all costs. I think for the last 50 years, war has been avoided because we had the greatest arsenal in the world. We had stockpiles and stockpiles of stuff. The problem is we've depleted our stockpiles very quickly. A lot of the things that we gave to Ukraine, we depleted, ballpark numbers, 10 years of stockpiles in a few months. We make 650 or so Patriot missiles every year, and we used 400 of them in the first few days of Iran. So those and they take millions of dollars to build, and they take many years to build. So the future of war, I think, is not going to necessarily be determined on the battlefield or even in our enormous stockpiles, but rather who's able to do 3 things. Build fast, mass produce, and go through the iteration cycles much more quickly. Because if you look at what's happened in Ukraine, and I'm sure we have a number of people that have been in the drone world in Ukraine, The first drones, it didn't work so well. Okay, it crashed into a tree. Okay, let's fix it, quickly. All right, the next one, it hit a telephone pole. Okay, fine. Next. Today, Ukraine makes better drones than almost anyone in the world because they were able to iterate really fast. So you got to build quickly, you've got to mass produce, and you've got to iterate quickly. And whoever does that is going to win.
So now let me ask you about the Middle East. What is going on in the Middle East right now from your perspective? How does this end? What's the end game there? And then are you investing in technology? Are you playing any role in the Middle East?
To the latter point, we have portfolio companies that perhaps might be involved in the Middle East, which I can't talk about. But what we invest in is dual-use technologies. So to give you an example, imagine, if you will, an underwater drone. It's maybe 6 feet tall, it's electric, and you throw it overboard, and it maps the ocean floor, just like you're mowing your lawn. And it has a commercial use case. It's looking for oil pipeline leaks, or it's mapping the terrain to see where you're going to put your fiber optic cable. But, oh, by the way, it can also find unexploded ordnances, it can find mines, et cetera. So it's, again, dual use. There's a commercial component, and then there's a military component. Insofar as the first part of your question, I have no idea. I don't know. I think if anyone knows what's going to happen.
Going on in the Middle East, maybe before how it ends. How do you describe what's going on there?
The Middle East is arguably the most complicated geopolitical terrain in the world. So what's happening in the Middle East could change 5 minutes from now.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone really knows who's running Iran. Is it the foreign minister? I don't know, maybe. Maybe it's the head of the IRGC, or maybe it's someone else. So if you don't know who your counterparty is on a minute-by-minute basis, how can you do a deal? Yeah. I think what is happening, though, is that our Gulf allies are really getting into the fight. The Abraham Accords are doing what they intended to do. Interestingly, you're seeing Israelis on the ground in the UAE building Iron Dome. So you're starting to see these new poles of relationships that didn't exist before. Over on one side, you've got Iran, Russia, China's, I don't even know what China's at one level needs the oil to get out of the Gulf because 30% of their oil and gas comes from that region. On the other hand, they're bringing in ships with tons of explosives and drone parts. So over on that side and over on this side, you've got other actors, the UAE, the Gulf states, the Saudis, the US, Israel. So what's happening there on 5 minutes ago, something might have happened, and 10 minutes from now, something else may have happened. So who knows?
So thank you for taking, that's not an easy question. I want to ask you about China and AI, but just before I get to that, the Strait, you're an Annapolis grad, you're Army War College. Have you been doing...
Navy War College.
Navy War College, Army, okay. Yeah, those are fighting words, sorry about that. So you've probably seen simulations or are aware of scenarios. Did anyone predict what's going on in the Strait now, in the past, and what, given that you're so focused on maritime, what is interesting that people may not know that you're aware of?
Look, I don't think we invested ahead of the curve because we saw what was happening 2 years ago. Hormuz, which is 20 miles across. There's Malacca. There are, we've seen what's happened in Panama, the Drake Channel, the Strait of Magellan. So if you start looking at these choke points, you start realizing, maybe there's something here.
Yeah. Can you go to the slide that has 400 billion? And you had mentioned to me that that space has opened up about 600 billion.
So
just explain this a little bit.
So to be clear, we're a maritime-focused fund, dual use. And we said, is this too niche-y a thing? So let's start from the top down. It's a $35 trillion global market for trade, and we've condensed it to around $400 billion of annual TAM, compared to, let's say, roughly 600 million in space tech. So it's not very niche-y. If you look on that top left, we're sending people to Mars. and yet we've only mapped 25, 26% of the ocean. And the UN has mandated that we map 27 times the continental US. So maritime is a frontier that we've barely begun to exploit.
Right. So last two questions. You lived in China. What's your perspective on China and the threat it presents? And AI, what role does that play in geopolitics?
Yeah, look, I lived in China for many years. My kids were born there. And I always have to disclaimer this, so indulge me. Chinese people, lovely culture, wow, how interesting. Food, awesome food. And I draw a distinction between that and the Chinese Communist Party, which is perhaps not so great. And if you look at Korea, you have two Koreas, effectively. You've got North Korea, and you've got, obviously, South Korea, which is a democratic country. Similarly, and we don't frame things in this way, but we have the democratic China, which is Taiwan, and then we have the communist China. And it's going to be a very difficult balancing act to avoid the Thucydides trap. And you're going to have the greatest statespeople in the world to keep this from going kinetic. But the structural imbalances when a rising power meets an existing power don't always end well, let's just say. And at this point in time, and I may be a bit aggressive in what I say, but indulge me, some people say that China is a near-peer competitor, or they are a competitor. Well, I don't know. Competitors play within the given bounds of a rule book, right? So if the Miami Dolphins play the Patriots, and then the Miami Dolphins, pull out switchblades and start stabbing the Patriots players, hey, we won, you laugh, it's ridiculous. And so when you don't play within the bounds of a given rule book, when you steal intellectual property, when you fly balloons over our military bases, when you flood the zone with fentanyl, you're not really playing fair. You're sort of hitting below the belt. And that's when you move from being a competitor to being an adversary. And it's painful to say that because nobody really wants, at least I'll speak for myself, and probably speak for all of you, nobody wants to have a conflict. So I think hopefully cooler heads will prevail, things will simmer down, but it's going to take a lot of work.
All right. AI and geopolitics, what are you seeing? What are your predictions?
I've been thinking a lot about this. So right now, our leading models, whether it's Claude or OpenAI, whatever, we're trying to charge people, let's say $20 or more for the better models, whereas DeepSeek is probably, let's say it's 8 months, 7-8 months behind. It's pretty good, right? It's not, it's not an A plus, maybe it's an A minus, but it's getting there. Plus, they're distilling everything from our models. From a geopolitical standpoint, the thing that makes me wonder where the world is going is, if you are in the developing world, and as you mentioned, I was a couple of years at the World Bank. If you're a developing country, say you're Peru or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, whatever, you go with the free stuff. And when your entire population is on DeepSeek, right, the next logical step is for China to say, hey, your e-government and your smart cities, let's put those on DeepSeek. Oh, and by the way, we'll build you a data center. Oh, and a power gen, facility. And all of a sudden, you've harvested the entire brain power of a country, and you control it. And I think that's something for our policy leaders to think about.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Bethel.